Assalamu alaikum, friends, and welcome to this evening's edition, season 11, episode 5 of Book Bites. I've been watching, and all been watching, as increasing escalation of violence out in Palestine. And I've been, thinking back to the kind of details of apartheid South Africa, having recently read Guilty and Proud, a new memoir of an MK soldier's uh, experience of exile, prison, and eventually freedom. And this is the story written and, in such beautiful and excruciating detail. I found this a devastating book, the autobiography and memoir of Marion Sparg, who we'll be speaking to this evening, drawing on comparisons, but also reminding us of a time we came through, a very difficult, very excruciating time for our country. And to be able to draw on those kinds of examples, to see what's happening as we watch a genocide taking place live in front of us, and to be able to, really draw on both the psychological aspect and the sense of helplessness that one feels both within the space and beyond. And also to understand that we relied so much on the international community for solidarity, for boycotts, and for really bringing apartheid to a standstill. But it's the ordinary individuals behind the scenes who are really, really putting their lives on the line. And we'll be speaking to Marion Sparg, who graduated from Rhodes University in 1979 with a degree in journalism. She worked briefly at Sunday Times before leaving the country in 81 when she was just 23 years old to join Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the then anti-apartheid sort of struggle run under the ANC. And in 86, she was given a 25-year prison sentence for high treason, of which she served eventually 5 years. And one of the major sort of acts of defiance was when she bombed John Foster Square at the time. I don't think we can drive past Johannesburg Station now, even in 2024, and not feel that extreme sense of foreboding. She was freed in 91. Sparg worked as publicity secretary in the ANC border region and then coordinator of Cyril Ramaphosa's office at ANC HQ from 91 to 94. After the first democratic elections in 1994, she served in various capacities in the new government. In 2000, she became CEO of the National Prosecuting Authority, a position that she retained until her resignation in 2007, following a public spat between then Deputy President Jacob Zuma and the NPA. Since leaving the NPA, Marion Sparg has been working in the private sector as communications strategist. She lives in Johannesburg with her two daughters, Michelle and Joy. Um, Welcome to the show. Welcome to Book Bites, Marion. It's wonderful to have had the opportunity to read this excruciating and beautifully written memoir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Shafinaaz, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening.
I was it's an incredibly sobering read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. There's no doubt I'm going to be picking it up again because, in such beautiful detail, you outline the reason for the struggle. You're unapologetic about how you handle the case. There's no way that you tried to even sort of lessen the charges against you in any particular way, even when your legal counsel gave you advice to the. And this was a devastating time. You were very young. You took on, so many parts of the struggle at a time when some of us would not have been able to make such major decisions. Speak to us about your thinking at the time, engaging social consciousness in the 70s, and what was it like as a white South African living in a time of apartheid?
Well, as I say in the book, I grew up in a typical white middle class South African family and community. My family was not particularly political. Um, and I suppose the wake up for me really came when once I left, matriculated, and went to Rhodes University. Rhodes was not a very politically active campus at the time, but nevertheless, I think the sort of the defining event, I think, which really, in a way, determined the way forward for me was the murder of Steve Biko. Biko had been at, had visited Rhodes University, and that is where he actually um, is said to have made his break with white liberalism, and went on to found SASO. Um, and it was as we will also remember it, Donald Woods, the editor, then editor of the Daily Dispatch, the local newspaper, um, we had become quite close friends with Biko, and when he exposed the murder of Biko, he ran a remarkable front page, which, as I say in the book, looked more like a poster, hailing a dead black hero, and not the front page of what was quite an ordinary newspaper at the time. And so it was getting to know about Biko later on, finding out exactly just how terrible his death was and his time at the hands of the security police, but also importantly, just witnessing the reaction of so many of my fellow white students at Rhodes University. Um, Many of them were not political at all. They weren't interested in politics. They didn't know who Biko was. They had probably never even heard his name before his death was blazoned over all the newspapers. But somehow they just swallowed the apartheid propaganda. He was a dead black terrorist, and that was it as far as they were concerned. And I suppose that was really where I began to question um, my place in society as a white South African.
I noticed, obviously throughout the text, so you're at the stage of a developing social consciousness. This is very much, you're able to notice what's happening and how this sort of grates against your own moral dynamic. It was so important for the apartheid state to dehumanize and to consider that anyone working against the state was a terrorist, just in order to legitimize the killings that happened around. Speak to us about working in the newsroom as a young journalist and then having to decide how to engage the material that came through at the time.
Well, one of my first experiences, after I graduated, the first job I had was actually as a sub editor at the Daily Dispatch. Donald Woods had left, of course, by that time and was in exile. And I was obviously a very junior sub editor, and this was late 79 that I joined the Daily Dispatch. And things were quite ordinary there. I mean, there wasn't really much happening. One came in. These were the days before everything was computerized and digitalized, of course. And so everything, bits of paper would come down a vacuum tube, and stuff would come in from SAPA and other news agencies. And these bits of paper would be handed to us around the table. We worked at night, obviously, because it was a daily newspaper. And the one evening when I came in, something was different. I could sense that there was something different happening. There seemed to be a lot of tension in the room. And as I discovered, what was called the Silverton Siege was actually taking place in Pretoria. And a shootout, literally minutes before I had walked into the newsroom to assume my duty, a shootout had taken place between three members of Umkhonto we Sizwe and the South African police. And they had all died in this shootout. I won't go into the detail of the siege, but it seems it wasn't a planned thing. It was these three MK cadres had been spotted and taken refuge in the bank. They were demanding the release of Nelson Mandela and so on. And one of the stories came to me, and it was quite a remarkable story, actually. It was an interview that a journalist had held with one of the hostages, a white woman. And she spoke about a conversation that she'd had with one of the cadres. And she said she asked him why they were doing this and what their motivation was. And he told her that he was doing it because he loved his country. Now, all the usual headlines I knew that were going to appear were going to be all about, terror and terrorists and blood and guns and horror and that type of thing. The usual kind of coverage that an event like that would get in a newspaper in South Africa at the time. And I decided to put up a headline which said, I love my country. And when I sent it off to the chief sub editor who checked everything before it went off to the printing room, I saw that he was busy changing the headline. And I went up, I got so annoyed, I went up and asked him what he was changing it to. And he changed it to something like Screams of Terror or something like that. And I said to him, that's actually got nothing to do with the article. If you read the article, she doesn't say anything about screams and being terrified. She's talking about the fact that this so-called terrorist is telling her that he loves his country. He decided to keep my headline, as he told me later, but it was, from the Daily Dispatch, I went on to the Sunday Times as a reporter a few months later when I was offered a position there. I was very fortunate because I was given a very wide brief by the news editor at the time at the Sunday Times was Hans Stradum. And he allowed me pretty much to cover what I wanted to cover. So, I covered politics and labor and religion and all sorts of things, and got to know people in the course of my duties as a journalist, got to know people like Alan Bosak and Bishop Tutu and Beyers Naudé. And yeah, there were many times I had a very short experience as a journalist, a short working experience. Um, and I suppose my experience as a journalist really came to an end when I and a few other colleagues embarked on a one-day solidarity strike. The biggest strike of black journalists was taking place at the time, led by Moasa. And we felt that there had to be some sort of gesture of solidarity from us as their white colleagues. And it was a small group of us, it was less than 10 of us. But anyway, that nearly got me fired. And shortly after that, I decided that I didn't think there was any point in trying to make a difference or to report anything differently. There were journalists who were trying very hard and I think did make a difference, but I couldn't see myself being in that position for much longer.
Let's talk about, get into the meat a bit. Let's talk about um, training with MK and the bombing of John Foster Square, which was seen as such a difficult space to get into,
Mm.
and how you might have used some amount of training and privilege to reach that space and do what needed to be done.
Yeah, I had decided early on that, if it was ever agreed that I would be deployed inside the country as an MK cadre, because of course I couldn't take that as a given, even though it was agreed that I could go for training, etc. But when I was finally deployed as a member of special operations based from Lesotho, from Maseru, I decided to target in particular police stations. And I felt that it was going to be, because of my white skin and being a woman, I felt that it was going to be not necessarily easy, but a lot easier for me to try and access those kind of facilities than any black member of MK would. And indeed, that did prove to be the case. I mean, the irony is that on the morning when I went to John Foster Square in March '86 to go and place the limpet mines there, I had done a reconnaissance a few days earlier, and I found that I wasn't stopped at the gate. I was simply allowed through. But on this particular morning, now with the limpet mines in my handbag, a black policeman was on duty at the gate, and he stopped me and he said he needed to search me. I realized if that happened, it would all be over. So I noticed that a white policeman was reading a newspaper in the guardhouse next to him. So I made noise, not a lot of noise, but I objected loudly enough so that this white policeman could hear what was going on. And he came out, as I expected him to do, and reprimanded his black colleague and said, "You can't search a white woman, let her go." So, yeah, it was simply the color of my skin and the fact that I was a woman. I think that I was able to get access to John Foster Square on that particular morning with the limpet mines. And yes, as I say, I had decided that whatever advantage I could use of being a white woman as a member of MK, I would use.
Speak to us about training in the camps and getting to Angola. What was that experience like?
The My experience in the camps was an extremely positive one. There have been many accounts written of the MK camps in Angola. Some of them positive, others not so positive, and I think it's important that we acknowledge all of those. However, as I say, my experience was a very positive one. Um, I spent the first my first stint of training. I spent about 9 months in a camp called Kashito in the south of Angola, very close to Luanda. For most of the time, I was the only woman in the camp. When I arrived, there were two other women. They didn't stay very long before they left. They'd already completed their training, and so I was. It was a small camp, probably about 80 to 100. The other camps were much larger. And I must say that I felt welcome from the first day there. I never experienced any kind of harassment. There was never a day when I didn't feel safe. I know a lot of people have looked at me with horror when you say you spent 9 months in a camp in the bush in Angola with one white woman with all these black men. Weren't you terrified? And I said, no, I've actually never felt safer in my life. Um, I was well taken care of. But as I say, there have been many different accounts of MK camps. And one doesn't want to question the veracity of any of those. There are certainly women who have very brave women who have written of less positive experiences than the one I had. But I certainly, as I say, um, felt that it was I was in when I got to camp, I realized the first thing I realized that most of the cadres there were of my generation or a couple of years older. Those in command and those who were training me had left South Africa in the wake of the 76 uprisings. And many of them had never ever spoken to a white person, let alone have a white woman training with them now in an MK camp. But as I say, I was made to feel welcome. I was taken care of.
It certainly gives a sense of comrades with a common purpose looking out for each other. But there's also, and I've seen this in a few accounts, and definitely it comes through in your memoir, um, the story of deception, the story of spies within the ranks. And this is precisely how, for example, the Maseru massacre takes place. Speak to us about that incident and others like it, where you
Mm.
know that comrades have been compromised because of spies in the ranks.
Yeah, I was in Lesotho at the time of the second Maseru massacre, which was in December '85, and we only found out much later. At the time, of course, we were unaware of exactly what had led to the massacre and the role that an agent had or spy for the apartheid regime had played in the whole dreadful process. I was in contact with I suppose, about 8 to 10 people in Maseru at the time. And, as a member of special operations who was going in and out of the country, obviously I was only allowed access to a very limited number of comrades in Maseru. And I was staying alone at the time I was in Maseru. As I said, I was staying alone in a house. And the only thing that kind of kept me in touch with the world, apart from occasional visits from my commander, of course, was listening to the news on a small shortwave radio that I had. And so on the morning of the massacre, the news came over on BBC, and it spoke of two people being massacred. Um, and those were two people that I knew very well, Jackie Quinn and Leon Meyer, as he was known then. Oh, sorry, Leon Meyer is his real name. We knew him as Joe Jaluka in Maseru. And shortly after that news, my commander arrived, and he then obviously informed me that it was, in fact, many more people. I think there were approximately 10 comrades, including a couple of Lesotho citizens who had been massacred. And we discovered later, and it came out through the whole TRC process, that the whole event had been set up by an agent working with Eugene de Kock and his band of killers. He had arranged for a braai or a small party of some sort at his house and invited a specific group of people. Um, my commander, whose name was Edwin Mabitsa, told me that he had in fact decided to come and collect me to attend this braai as well, because a couple of the comrades who were there had recently arrived from the camps in Angola, and he thought it would be good for me just to meet them and see them. And the only reason why we didn't turn up at the braai was because he said they were on there was a curfew, a night curfew in place in Maseru at the time. And he said they ran out of petrol on the way to come and collect me, and because there was a curfew, etc., he just felt that the security situation was not good, so they simply left the car wherever they were and decided to walk home. And so it was really, as you say, there for the grace of God, go I, because if the car had enough petrol, both of us would have been there and would have been amongst the dead as well. It was a devastating experience, because it was quite for me, because the group of people were killed were quite literally all the people that I was in contact with at the time, with the exception of my commander, of course, who did survive. And it's difficult to explain the type of emotions that come to the fore when you realize that it's one of your own, or someone that you thought was a comrade who was with you in the cause, um, who was responsible for setting up such a massacre. And of course, I had heard about difficulties in the camps before I left them. There was, many rings of apartheid spies had been exposed, and the security team, if I can put it right there, or department in Angola, was heavily criticized for taking a very heavy hand, and there were a lot of atrocities they committed. We have to admit that has come out in the reports of various commissions that the ANC itself set up whilst in exile. But at the same time, it's, when you go through an experience like that one in Maseru, it's, as I say, you begin to understand some of the emotions that come to the fore when you realize that, as I say, that it's someone that you thought was your comrade, who was responsible for working with the enemy. Yeah.
So on the one hand, you have these sort of the apartheid spies, the difficulty of actually being able to trust who you're working with on such a sensitive operation. But we've seen so much of sort of lack of remorse, not just at the time that you're writing about in so much of vivid detail, but you still see a certain amount of lack of remorse for people who worked with the state, people who worked with the apartheid government. That psychology is so difficult to understand, and so speak to us about some of that, some of encountering that lack of remorse. You speak about some of the interrogators that you directly had to encounter during your incarceration, but generally I think you still some were then taken on into the new dispensation in certain positions, like the security sort of. Speak to us about some of that.
Yeah, a number of the well, I think not just in my interrogation team, but a number of security police ended up in what was called at the time crime intelligence. Um, and yeah, I suppose from those security police members themselves, I don't know, I didn't really expect much remorse from them. Most of those you met were pretty hardened individuals. There were some very young, inexperienced members of the security police that I came across as well, men and women. And but the more senior ones in charge, quite frankly, I didn't expect them to turn around and have any kind of remorse. Not the ones that I dealt with in any case. But the I think where the I've been doing some research lately on the murders of Victoria and Griffiths Mxenge, the activists and lawyers in the 80s, who were murdered in the 80s in KwaZulu Natal. And one of the people, obviously, who was responsible for their murders was Dirk Coetzee, who is now late. But I remember I interviewed Griffiths Mxenge only has one surviving brother, Dr. Fumbata Mxenge, who is now has turned 80. And I watched an interview of or video of a meeting that he agreed to hold with Dirk Coetzee around the time that the TRC sittings were taking place in the late 90s. And the thing that comes through there is that complete lack of remorse, as you say.
Mm,
Um, and Dirk Coetzee, and I think it's not as if he didn't once actually during that whole interview, what struck me was he didn't once even try and apologize for what he'd done. He was just simply trying to explain himself and kept on saying that he was basically brainwashed by apartheid. And that was, the reason why he did all these terrible things. And I find that that probably is a I think there was a lot of social conditioning. One can't I don't know if one wants to use the term brainwashed to describe, but certainly, I think those, particularly in the security forces and particularly in the security police itself, did go through a lot of conditioning, obviously. They were subjected to a lot of propaganda. Um, but at the end of the day, we are reasoning human beings,
mm.
and surely we must be able to be to see at the end, even if they couldn't see at the time, surely after the fall of apartheid, you would have expected someone like a Dirk Coetzee to be able to understand that, he was it's not just being on the wrong side of a struggle or of justice, but as an individual taking accountability. And sadly, there has not been much of that, whether it's from those who were in the security police or the apartheid politicians.
And I think we can, it's suffice to say that a currently, when we look at world politics, we're able to test how far that social conditioning has gone
Mm,
because you still find people who are not necessarily involved in any politics just
mm,
have no remorse about apartheid in other parts of the world. And you just have to look at online commentary to get a sense of how, people being killed, non-combatants being killed in other parts of the world really don't stir emotion in people when they think, well, it's a lesser being that's out there being killed. So we're still not we have a lot of work to do in terms of non-racialism in the world in general. Marion, Guilty and Proud, this incredible, powerful, and like I said, sobering memoir. Where do you see, I recommend this read for absolutely everyone, both within and beyond the borders of South Africa. What are your hopes for having put this brave and courageous memoir out there? I know that you're currently launching around the country. And what can you tell us onward from here? What are your hopes for this book?
Well, I hope it's read as widely as possible, and particularly by the younger generation. As I say in the introduction to the book, I wrote it largely wrote it for my two daughters who are both in their early 20s. And I certainly hope that the younger generation are able, to read the book and grasp what I'm trying to say. And yeah, one really hopes that it does make some kind of contribution to fighting this demon of racism, as you say. One of the things that is still frightening to me is you were talking about the reaction to the genocide in Palestine, in Gaza. If you compare, if you just look at social media and compare the reactions of white South Africans to what was going on in Ukraine a little while ago, and then compare the reaction to what's happening in Gaza, and it's worlds apart. It's as if what happened in Ukraine was terrible, that these were people who were dying, and yes, it was terrible. But when it comes to Palestine, somehow it's okay because, as you say, they're somehow lesser human beings if they regard them as human beings at all. So I really hope that that what But the ANC, the lessons that I learned from the ANC was the value of humanism, of non-racialism. And I really hope those are the kind of things that the younger generation can get from my book.
I think this book also reminds us that as South Africans, we are perfectly positioned to take the lead in the fight against apartheid in other parts of the world as well. Marion, thank you so much for your time this evening. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I know that this book will add to the conversation and will engage consciousness. It's an important social document for our time and historically for where we've been. Once again, congratulations on an absolutely beautiful book. And thank you so much for your time this evening as well. We wish you everything of the best from us and the team on Book Bites.
Thank you very much, Shafinaaz, and thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you.
And so there you have it. We spoke to MK veteran Marion Sparg. Please do get copies of the book, gift them, read them, contemplate and reflect on them, especially when we continue to see apartheid around the world and in Palestine. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.